I am Liz Powell. I am the founder and CEO of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth. We have been around 18 years now. I worked on the Hill before that, and we do a lot of policy work, non-dilutive government funding, tracking all that's going on, and try to help a lot of entrepreneurs and nonprofits navigate this to help grow their organizations. So we launched this What's Happening in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago now. In partnership with Grip Venture Studio. We're all members of Grip, and which is a great organization to help entrepreneurs and growing emerging companies grow faster with all the assistance that you need to do that. So all kinds of experts from marketing, pricing, access to venture capitalists, government funding, all these different aspects that it takes to grow a business. So Grip Venture Studio is another great resource for you. Our amazing speakers, panelists that join me each quarter are Chris Oates and Chris Campbell. And Chris Cooper is on as well. Sometimes he chimes in with his expertise as our most recent Hill staffer. So what we'd like to do is start off with introductions. So you heard mine, so I will pass to Chris Oates to do your introduction.
Hi, my name's Chris Oates. I live in Massachusetts. I've worked on ballot campaigns, Senate campaigns, although that was more the door knocking variety. And more importantly for this, I've been a political risk analyst, which is basically about, usually it's for countries that are experiencing or have experienced coups, dictators, dramatic changes in regulation. So when I started this, people said, "You're covering the US. Why are you doing this?" And as it turns out, I was just prescient. So that's what I do, generally try to forecast what's going on.
And Chris Campbell.
Hey guys, Chris Campbell. I used to work on Capitol Hill for a million years. I ran two congressional committees, one Senate Judiciary Committee, the other Senate Finance Committee for then Chairman Orrin Hatch. Then I was later confirmed to the Department of Treasury in the first Trump administration for the first 2 years, where I helped steward the U.S. economy, and then left and helped sell it. Went to a financial firm. We sold the firm, and now I have my own firm where we independently advise the largest funds, families, and hypergrowth companies in the world grow in regulated spaces.
Great. All right. So we've got real experts in politics and policy. So there's just a few things going on. We've got budget, reconciliation, the president's skinny budget. Then there was an appendix to that with a little bit more detail. We've got the House and Senate starting to work on appropriations. We've got tariffs. We've got the war, Ukraine. We've got Iran and Israel escalation, USAID cuts, and what that means for lives that have been lost. We've got the economy, the stock market, tax cuts. There's like so many different things we could talk about. I think a good starting point for you, Chris Campbell, if you would help us out here, since you staffed this committee, if you could give an overview of how the budget and reconciliation process works, and then give us your insights on what you think is going to happen.
Get ready to get confused and disillusioned. So, budget reconciliation process is completely counterintuitive. It doesn't really make sense. It's very, very inside Washington. But what it effectively does is the House of Representatives, or the lower chamber of their executive legislative branch, is a majority-run system. So it's, if you have 50% plus one vote, you win. The Senate, U.S. Senate is not the same way, and so every one of the 100 senators has a disproportionate amount of power, where they can effectively stop anything they want to. If they wanted to, if they really want to lean in, they can stop pretty much anything they want to. And so it requires 60 votes in order, typically, to be able to cut off debate and then force a vote on something. In the history of the U.S. government, the Republicans have never had 60 votes in the U.S. Senate. The Democrats have had it 4 times. So as we're in a Republican-controlled government now, true to form, Republicans do not control 60 votes in the Senate. And so there is a process that was created a long, long time ago that allows to bring down that vote total from 60 to 51, 50 plus one votes on issues that directly impact the budget. These are issues, and it's really important to say that. So these are issues that are not policy, but directly have a direct budgetary impact. So that means that and exclusively they can only do these four things. They can either raise a tax or lower a tax, or they can raise spending or lower spending. They cannot change in any way policy at all. If they do, it's the process is called burging. And that provision of the bill will fall out of the bill because it will be challenged, and the Senate parliamentarian will rule that it's not budget, that does not have a direct budget impact. And so again, a lot of Washington gobbledygook in all of that, but that is to say that uh, you're directly and extremely constrained about what you can and cannot put in the bill. And the only thing that, and it's important to note, I think, because we've heard a lot of talk about entitlements in this process and what DOGE has done and what hasn't, that everything is subject to be put in a budget and reconciliation package, except for Social Security. Social Security is directly carved out, and so if Social Security is in any way impacted, even if it's adversely or directly well positioned in the bill, that the whole bill loses its status of 50 votes and goes back up to 60. So it cannot include anything on Social Security. And so it's important because Social Security is a huge driver of our debt. And so, but Medicare, Medicaid are subject to be put in that package. So that, Liz, I think gives you a little bit of a sense as to how that goes. The Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committees are the two committees of jurisdiction on reconciliation packages. And the House has done their part. Now the Senate is doing theirs. I would say as a backdrop to this, the Senate has, in my memory, been doing this far too long. I think I put together, I think, 10 reconciliation bills. The Senate has never swallowed the House bill. The House has always swallowed the Senate bill. And so we're now in a place where we're actually, I think, probably a better way of saying this, kind of the backdrop of what's happened in Minnesota, but like we're now shooting with live bullets on what the Senate is doing, because as the Senate produces something, it will very likely not be able to change much once it goes back to the House, because senators have a way of feeling like they control everything. So I just say that as we see the machinations now happening in the Senate Finance Committee and the committees, various committees that have been tasked to put together the larger package, we're going to see something emerge that's going to be instructive. And I think that for our audience, you guys should pay attention to not what the House produced, but what the Senate is going to produce, because that is likely going to become law.
That's very helpful. I don't know, Chris Oates, if you have comments on what's going on with this reconciliation process.
No, I just to echo what Chris Campbell said. I mean, right, the Senate is more indicative of the House. What I'm watching for is what comes out of the Senate. Can it pass the House? We assume that yes, we assume that every House Republican will eventually cave, because that tends to be what happens. They have a very small margin, so it all it takes is a few to say it's too much debt, or it's too much cuts to Medicaid, or it's not enough cuts to Medicaid. But that's what you're looking for. But I mean, I think at this point, I don't have a lot of faith that any House Republican will stand up to the combined pressure of the entire party and the White House. So I think you're right. I think that's going to be comes out of the Senate, and then it will basically pass the House.
Okay. I have a question for you, Chris Oates. So, amidst all of this activity in Washington, we've got some interesting things happening with elections. So, explaining sort of the off years that are Virginia, New Jersey, sort of what's going on with that. Primary activities already starting to heat up around that, and midterm. So, if you could just sort of give us an explanation of all that and then tell us what you think will happen.
Sure. So the first year of a presidential term, Virginia and New Jersey have gubernatorial elections. I think there might be some others, but those are always the highest profile. I think Louisiana and Kentucky also have off year, but I don't know if it's this year or in 2 years. But Virginia and New Jersey are often seen as kind of bellwethers. In 2009, they were won by Republicans, Chris Christie in New Jersey. But then in 2017, they were won by Democrats. And it's seen as kind of a bellwether for the overall direction. Now, it's a tough one because in Virginia, you have a very strong candidate in Abigail Spanberger, who even if the political landscape was completely neutral, she would probably be favored to win. In New Jersey as well. I was just in New Jersey recently, and the Democrat is heavily favored over the Republican. Again, just on kind of personality and background basis. Um, but in terms of what's going to happen in 2026 with the primary, so that's just to say, I think Virginia and New Jersey this year are less indicative than they haven't been in past cycles because you have a real discrepancy in candidate quality. But what you are seeing in the congressional ballot, it's at this point it's a little jumpy. I've seen Democrats up by 2 points. I've seen Democrats up by 8 points. But just to note that in 2018, the difference was Democrats +8 nationally, and in that's kind of a wave election. That's what we should think of probably as like the high water mark of where they could be. We don't know, but like that would be a wave election that would give them certainly the House and maybe a couple seats in the Senate, although that's going to be harder. Um, that is the kind of the general forecast. In primaries, though, what I think is really interesting is you're not seeing a huge progressive versus moderate fight in a lot of primaries. So Michigan is a great example. There's three, I think, relatively strong candidates for the Michigan Senate seat. Um, but the one that is most closely affiliated with Bernie Sanders has said that he might vote for Chuck Schumer as majority leader, whereas the one who, Mallory McMorrow, who was on stage at the DNC, has said that she wouldn't, or at least she'd be not likely to. And what's interesting is that it's not necessarily this is the year of progressives versus this year of moderates, kind of 1990s redux. It does seem to be who is willing to say that we are back in normal times and we're going to do normal stuff and we're going to campaign normally and we're going to put out press releases and do press conferences, and who are the ones saying this isn't normal. We have to be thinking differently. Now, I'm obviously in the we need to be thinking differently camp because that's what I've been trained to do as a political risk analyst, is to like see if this time is different. But if you're a 40-year incumbent, I mean, well, arguably 40-year incumbents don't think a lot anyway, but to the extent that they do, they are locked into mental models that have been in place for decades. So that's what I think is going to be interesting. Do we start to see incumbents who have been around for a while within the Democratic Party? Certainly, that's what I'm paying most attention to. But do we see them start to lose to younger candidates? And then in the generals, do we start to see either younger candidates or different candidates or outsider candidates start to pick up momentum? And that to me would be an indication that we're likely to see an overperformance for Democrats simply because, if outsider candidates are winning and there seems to be outsider momentum, that tends to redound to the benefit of the out party. And one note, one race, if you're really interested in watching like the early stages of a Senate race, is Iowa, where Joni Ernst is the incumbent. There are two, I believe, declared Democratic candidates. One is a 45-year-old minor league pitcher, which I don't really know how good that minor league is, if there's a 45-year-old who's still pitching. And one is the Democratic leader of the state Senate, who's actually married to a friend's sister. So I guess I'm pulling for him, although I met him once and only once at a wedding, and he just kind of talked about himself. But that's fine. He's a politician. So that's a race that I think would be interesting because that is one that is going to start to be polled early, and because it's Iowa, you have a very engaged population civically, so they might start to pay attention. So that to me is like the early bellwether that I'm tracking.
Interesting. Chris Campbell, do you have any thoughts on the elections these early days?
Yeah, look, I was on Capitol Hill during I'm a Republican, obviously. I was on Capitol Hill during the Tea Party time within the Republican Party, and this to me just feels exactly like the Tea Party time, but just the Democratic Party now. So I think that what I would say is that candidates really matter, but candidates who ultimately go to the general election ballot have to face a primary. And as I see it, there's a huge struggle, as we saw it in the Republican Party during the Tea Party movement, where that North Star is for the Democratic Party compared to where the Republican Party is. The Tea Party movement certainly shifted Republicans to the right and more populist. And it seems like the Democrats are moving in that direction as well. I believe that if they do that, it will, I think, again, this is a Republican saying this, all those caveats. I think that will depress the vote. So I think we're going to see a crop of more progressive uh, Democratic candidates getting on the ballot for the general and not doing amazingly well in the primaries, and then not doing amazingly well in the generals, just like we had in the Republican Party when we started nominating, those who've been following this a long time. We nominated a witch in Nevada and a whole bunch of other things, and so we kind of went crazy. And I think that the Democrats are having their crazy moment.
I just want a point of information. The witch was in Delaware.
Delaware,
Nevada
sorry.
was you should pay for your doctor in chickens. Just
I apologize.
sorry about that.
Important distinction. All right. Okay, so let's sticking on this topic of politics, which I guess is everywhere. Want to ask both of you if you could advise both parties. Where is the greatest opportunity? What would you advise them to be doing right now? And I think that we're seeing more the Democrats are getting criticized quite a bit for not really stepping out and coming up with a clear strategy, but there's also been some criticism on the Republican side too, and that people aren't speaking up and challenging, Trump. Everyone's scared of Musk pouring in millions of dollars. So I think there's enough to go around, but would love to know what you guys think are the opportunities and how you would advise either party on this one. So we can go back to you, Chris Oates.
Sure. I think the Republican is depends on who you are, but let's say you're Mike Lawler of New York, who is in a swing district and also might run for governor. I would say your opportunity is to separate yourself from the party, because if you look at Donald Trump's approval ratings, they're going down, and he's not running for office again. I think Donald Trump has a particular quality because of his, reality TV and celebrity experience, uh, that can't be repeated with a JD Vance. So I would say you don't want to stick on a boat that might be sinking. You want to establish yourself more independently. And so for that, I would say the most important thing is Medicaid cuts in the upcoming reconciliation package. Position yourself against them, vote against it if possible, or at the very least say that you fought to minimize that. So that would be it. Think about what happens after Trump leaves the stage. Because I think too many people are living like news cycle to news cycle. On the Democratic side, it'd be very similar. It's like think long term, but this is more at the moment. I don't know why you would spend too much time worrying about policy, because Democratic policy is not going to be adopted at the national level until 2029 at the earliest. So I'd say right now the fight is for public opinion. What are the things that you can do to get public opinion? The most important thing is how to fight in this information environment, because Chuck Schumer, one of the things that I'm not a fan of Chuck Schumer, if anyone can't pick that up, but one of the things that he used to do is he would introduce a bill that was designed to go nowhere, but would get him a press conference to really a press release, and then we get some news attention. He used to love to do that apparently on his Sunday, because then you get into Monday newspapers where often they would need copy. But what happens now is that, for example, he, I believe, introduced a bill. It was around something that was already illegal. I think it was maybe around like the Qatar jet, and he like introduced a bill to ban that. But to a lot of people, if that's in social media, like that makes it seem like it's currently legal, and he would make it illegal. So the idea of the messaging bill doesn't work. So the most important thing I would say is probably look to Pete Buttigieg. How do you fight in this informational environment for public opinion over the next 2 years? You don't have a lot of formal power. Use it where you can. Think about what your red lines are for the upcoming budget showdown at the end of September, possible government shutdown. But basically, for the next 2 years, the battle is around public opinion. So what do you have to do that? And then what do you do if you win a trifecta in 2029 to basically put an end to all of this? And for me, that would be you have to plan on how to rebalance the three branches of government so that Congress is actually powerful. Um, what are you going to do? What's your economic plan? What's your social plans? But I think it's less about if a Senate candidate came to me right now, I would say you don't need to worry about like how to win tomorrow's news cycle, because that ultimately doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about a policy because ultimately you have no power. Like, what's your long-term vision for the future of the party, and then try to fight. Maybe start a podcast. Maybe that's like the tactical experience. Although that didn't work out for Gavin Newsom, I would say get on other people's podcasts, because the problem I think this is just a side note, but every single member of Congress thinks we want to hear from them. We really don't want to hear from them that much. So get other people's audiences. They're not going to build an audience of their own.
Interesting. All right, Chris Campbell.
It's actually really easy for me. I'll make it really short. So I think that oftentimes and every time when like state capitals or the national capital is controlled by one party, that one party has a really difficult time typically of governing, and they typically tend to overread the mandate, and they tend to go into areas where like it's a little bit murky, and they're like effectively perhaps not the reason why they were elected or given that much power in the first place. And so I would just caution, members of the Congress and the administration to restrain themselves and to maintain a posture where I believe they are today. And of course, Democrats will wildly oppose what I'm going to say, but I think that they're typically taking a common sense approach where the other side has to respond to and defend like child molesters or people kidnap people or whatever it is, right? So like if we want to like a Bray or Garcia or someone like that. It's really difficult if you're a Democrat. Like, where do you go? How do you position yourself? Like, are you going to be against Israel as a Democrat? I mean, like, it's really hard, right? So, I think that the administration has done a pretty good job of kind of taking effectively a common sense approach, and I'm just like in 80-20 issues, where 80% of the American public are typically tend to be commonly with where the administration is going. Then I think that, so I would caution and give that advice to the Republicans, Democrats. I believe I believe they will not do this, and they will bet almost all the money I have that they will not do this. But I would tell you, if they did do this, they would kick our butts in the next off cycle, in the next congressional election. Is if they can find someone like Bill Clinton and someone who's in the middle of the country, purple, amazingly good speaker, kind of rises above stuff and is not overly partisan. I believe that they would become the majority party, and certainly the House. They will not do that. They're going to go AOC style and Bernie Sanders, and that will, I think, further reduce their numbers in Congress, and then endanger their chances in regaining the presidency in 4 years. 3 years.
Yeah, very, very interesting assessments from both of you. I think I agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. Okay. So if we have to look forward, given the budget stuff, they're trying to finish reconciliation by July 4th. They also working on FY26 appropriations, all these other issues going on. What does the fall look like? Like, where do you think will be, let's say September, October timeframe? What issues do you think will have gotten addressed, or what still will be problems for us to work on? And we'll switch it back to you, Chris Campbell.
That's a good question. So like, I think that the foreign challenges are going to will remain. I think that there is, it's growing increasingly likely that the United States is going to have to enter the Israeli-Iranian challenge. If that happens, it's going to be, it's really, really difficult to predict how that's going to happen, but it would certainly give the Democrats, and it will give the Democrats, a very big opening, because the American people, just in general, and for probably good reason, don't want to be embroiled in another Middle Eastern war. It's going to cost us trillions of dollars, and it will take a long, long time. That being said, I will say, as someone who has had presidential level clearance for a long time, the U.S. and the world cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It literally cannot happen. If they get it, the U.S. will be in danger. And so we just cannot allow it to happen. And so, it puts, politically speaking, it puts the administration in a very difficult position. Right now, they're positioned, I think, well, and as well as they can be, having the Israelis, doing this on their own, and us providing support when necessary. But if we actually do get called into with boots on the ground, it's going to be, it will certainly complicate things in many, many ways. I think that the budget reconciliation package will be passed by then, and for whatever that looks like, it is going to be what it is going to be, and I think it will set up well the dividing lines between the parties going into the congressional elections. So Democrats will suggest that Republicans are, kill all the poor people by ending Medicaid and giving tax breaks to all the rich people and hosing overtaxing the middle class. None of that will be true, but they will say it. And I think so. The battle lines will be drawn. The big question is, does that passage of the Budget Reconciliation Package, like it did in the first term of the Trump administration, unlock a great significant growth period in the U.S. economy? If that happens, it'll neuter what the Democrats are going to say. If it doesn't, and the broader economy, macro environment is still challenged, but probably because of the tariffs. That may be put a little bit of headwinds with Republicans going into congressional. So, but I think that you'll have Russia. I don't see any significant movement on the end of Russia, Ukraine, the Israel-Iran conflict. I think now, increasingly every single day, only has one. There's only one way of ending this. And, it'll never be said by the administration or probably international governments, but I don't believe there's any way other than regime change that will happen within Iran. And so I think, there's just going to be a significant amount of complications as it goes on. And remind people, I don't want to scare people, but Iran is the largest funder of terrorism. Independent countries, lone wolves, whatever. They're the largest funder of terrorism, both domestic and internationally in the world.
Yeah. Okay, Chris Oates. Yeah.
So I think no one can really predict what's going to happen a few months from now. I've been running kind of an exercise where I write down my predictions every so often with the Trump administration. And not to brag, but I'm very good at predicting things that will or won't happen. What I'm bad at is seeing the absurd things that no one saw coming. So like before the inauguration, I never would have predicted that USDIT would have been shut down. No one did. Because no one would have ever considered that as a possibility. The fact that Elon Musk would have actually had access to data or that again wouldn't have seen coming. There's a difference between like involvement versus that much or budget cuts versus that. So and certainly like on I predicted that tariffs would happen. Did I think that there was going to be tariffs on uninhabited islands? No, absolutely. Like no one saw that. So the big questions I have, I'd say not predictions, but here are the questions that I would be thinking of the variables. One is tariffs. We're currently in a pause. Kind of assume that the pause is going to continue, like the TikTok ban, which even though the law says you can't do it, we just keep not enforcing it. So will the tariffs kind of keep being paused? Will they go up? Will they go down? The reconciliation package, when will it pass? I'd say probably, I agree, or sometime in the summer. And if it does, then what happens with government funding for the end of September? Is there going to be a government shutdown? Do Democrats apply 7 votes to keep government open? And then, yes, on foreign policy, I think Russia and Ukraine, does Russia collapse in that time? I doubt it. There are now strains on their economy that there kind of weren't in the past. So it is possible that they, have less advantages on the battlefield, and that Ukraine starts to make some progress. But I doubt that there would be any resolution within the next few months. And then yeah, Israel, Iran. This is remarkable in its unnecessariness, according to U.S. intelligence. Iran is nowhere close to not immediately for going to get a bomb. That's what Tulsi Gabbard said at her confirmation hearing. And I mean, right now, Iran is almost certainly going to, if this regime survives, they're going to certainly get a nuclear bomb. Like, there's no way they're going to engage in diplomacy ever again. There's a reason why we did not invade North Korea, because they have nuclear weapons, and why we have not escalated against Russia, because they have nuclear weapons. So Iran knows if you get a nuclear weapon, you're safe. Or that's what the interpretation is going to be. So, and then if there is a regime change operation, well, then that opens up a whole other set of questions, because there are severe flashbacks to the Iraq War, where it's like, oh, we're going to go down, we're going to be created as liberators. And it's like, sure, but what happens next? Iran has over 90 million people in it. The most likely new government to take over, if there is a regime change, is hardline IRGC members who set up kind of a military dictatorship. This was what was going to happen in the Soviet Union until Yeltsin kind of intervened. But that's what you would likely to see, or a civil war similar to what happened in Libya, or some kind of chaotic thing with millions and millions of refugees. And just kind of when we're talking about secondary order effects, if you remember in 2015, the million refugees that went into Europe and how that has reshaped European politics. That was largely from the war in Syria, which I believe Syria has less than 20 million people. So you're talking about a country more than 4 times larger, possibly much worse outcomes, possibly the US getting directly involved. And I think anything that we kind of predict about what might happen, we can't know because let's be honest, Pete Hegseth is not the man for a wartime. It's not like he's sitting there reading briefings at night with his extensive set of policy advisors who he like 2 months ago put on polygraphs because they were leaking. So we have a situation where we have a president, which let's be honest, he's not a smart person. You might say he is clever in politics, but he's not like ultimate briefer. You would not say evacuate Tehran if you were a cogent, competent individual. So we don't know what's going to happen, and that's I think the most important thing to stress is we don't know what's going to happen. Um, we can have some predictions, but ultimately the uncertainty is far greater than anything that any pundit on TV will tell you what is going on.
Yeah. Wow. It's kind of a depressing outlook, but very helpful. Okay, so let's talk about, you touched on this a bit, both of you touched on this a bit about Doge. Musk is gone. Interesting way he departed, all over social media. But anyway, he's gone. There are still Doge employees there, though. We've had, like, I've been tracking closely HHS, Health and Human Services, was 20,000 cuts April 1. There's been termination of grants, 800 NIH grants terminated, lots NSF, across the board. So, and then firings and RIFs, not rapid, reduction in force. So anyway, my question for you, Chris Oates, is how do you see the impact of all of this long term? Like long term, is this going to hurt the Republican Party? How does it impact Trump's ability to get folks to do things he wants? What are your thoughts on that long term impact of all that?
So, I mean, I think the biggest long-term impact of all of the various cuts, and let's just kind of group all of them together, is the impact on American innovation and science. Like the fact that, I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts. We're right next to Cambridge with Harvard and MIT. And the big thing people here are talking about, I talked to my government, is like, is this going to crush foreign students coming to learn? What does that do for the local economy? What does that do for these research institutions that need it? We don't know what's going to happen. They keep the cuts being are on, then they're there's an injunction against it, so we don't know. But that would, I think, be the longest term thing, substantively, is what it means to that. Certainly with the healthcare, research as well. Hearing about like entire teams and what RFK Jr. is doing, like eliminating anti-vaccine advisory or eliminating vaccine advisory groups. When you're also seeing the science papers that like we might have a vaccine against colon cancer, maybe, but maybe now that's going to be held up. So I think substantively that's that. But politically, I think the bigger issue is that every single thing that happens in government now is there's going to be a question about, did Trump cause this? Like in Rhode Island, it's a very local Rhode Island story, but a bridge collapsed. And well, it didn't like fully collapse, but you couldn't drive on it anymore. And that's the big story in Rhode Island, is repairing this bridge and how long it's going to take. And there's, yes, anger at the governor, but like no one blames the governor because no one thinks he caused the bridge to collapse. But if you're doing something around the FAA and then a plane crashes, well, the immediate question is, did a policy cause that? If there's when there was an outbreak of measles in Texas, it was, well, did RFK contribute to this? So I think what you're going to see is similar to George W. Bush with FEMA and Michael Brown in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's not going to be the disaster or the recovery or what. It's going to be that questions of, did they hurt the government? And what that means is stuff happens all the time in politics, but for the next year or 3 years, Democrats, whenever a disaster happens, can say, did Doge contribute to this? Was the NOAA understaffed because of Doge? And that sort of thing just grinds down your approval ratings over time when every single day in the news it's what happened, what are the questions? Because journalists love questions. They don't like need answers, but they love pursuing questions. And I think that's the sort of thing that's going to be, yeah, for the next 3 years, always going to be in the back of any news story about any kind of disaster.
Yeah, what do you think, Chris Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree. I think that the Doge stuff is, I mean, I just, be a little more candid there, typically would be. I think the president had and found an amazing someone to help him. Is probably another way of saying it. That became the villain here, right? So the president actually skated through this, and Elon Musk is, took all the arrows to the president, and developed a core mission for the Republican Party is always kind of fraud, waste, and abuses for both sides. But it's it's kind of like the fundamental DNA of the Republican Party to cut government. And so, it was an effort in doing that, and I think it scratched the itch for conservatives. But I think Chris Oates is right. I think that no matter what happens now, because it's been touched, that anything that's going to happen, but this is true when any government takes over, the government that owns the challenges. And so I think I think that trying to find a way to keep those cuts from coming into effect is going to be it's going to be important. It's like, does Congress pass a law that would require the reduction in funding on a multi-year basis? It's important to note that what Doge did is a 1 year savings. It's not like a multi-year savings, and so you have to do this every single year in order for this to work. And that's obviously not practical, and so it will require Congress, and going back to what I said before, it will require 60 votes in the Senate to be able to reduce that spending. And the entire time in Washington I've spent, and I worked for Orrin Hatch, who was the longest serving Republican senator in the history of our country. In his entire public service, the government only grew, it never shrunk. Government has never reduced or eliminated any program it's ever created. It only grows them. And the government spends $1.2 for every $1 it takes in. So we continue to saddle our future generations with a debt that they will never pay and never be able to pay. Which will constrain our public policy and foreign affairs significantly. And we'll see how it all ends up in the end of the day. But that's just unfortunately the trajectory of government.
Yeah, so let's stick with you, Chris Campbell. So you are a tax expert, budget expert from your background. So wanted to hear from you with all the tax cuts that are proposed, past the House, now it's into consideration in the Senate. Not asking for a summary of everything, but like nuggets of that you think would be good for our audience to hear about. Like what's something you're watching that you think folks should know about?
It'd be interesting, I think, to see how much the Senate agrees with the president on his campaign promises. There's no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits, all those kind of issues. All of them are deeply, as you can probably imagine, deeply politically popular for certain cohorts of Americans. I think, as a backdrop of this, and unfortunately, it's only getting worse. We're now at a place where about 71% of our country live paycheck to paycheck. And so that the chasm between those who work every single day and have to, and by the end of the month, they withdraw all of the money from their bank account and have to replenish it every single month to pay for everything. And those who can live multi-generations without ever working again. I think that chasm is incredibly, insanely large now. And so I think that it's going to be incumbent upon Congress. And I think that the president, will do a good job. And I think that it's win points if he's able to somehow close that gap as much as possible, giving at least even the petunia of the reemergence of some kind of middle class, or savings for average Americans. And so I think it's going to be incredibly incumbent as they put together the package, favoring the kind of those 71% of Americans who really struggle, and not favoring those who on the other side. And the challenges I've been doing tax policy for a very, very, very long time. If I were to put a bill as a Republican together that increases taxes on millionaires by $1 million and it takes everyone off that you're not a millionaire and off the rolls and makes them pay no taxes at all, Democrats will say that we as Republicans are raising taxes on the millionaires. Lowering taxes on millionaires and increasing taxes on the middle class. It's a Democratic talking point. They love to do it, no matter what the bill does, no matter what the truth is. And so that is going to be it doesn't matter what's in the bill. That's what the Democrats are going to say. I will tell you, as someone who actually put together the 2017 Act, which that Congress is now trying to extend, that it was the largest tax cut in American history. It removed more Americans off the federal burden and federal tax rolls than any other bill in the history of our country, and reduced tax burden on middle and lower income families more than any bill in the history of our country. The Democrats will never say that, and no matter what we do, we won't get through to that. But that is in fact the case. The best question I would ask anyone watching this is, if they go to a town hall or whatever it is, just to ask a Democrat, if they do nothing in this bill, what happens to the average American tax burden? Does it go up or does it go down? Every single person in the country would have the largest tax increase in the history of our government if Congress does nothing, doesn't pass the 2017 tax cuts. So the answer kind of answers itself, and so that's going to be the broader political challenge that Congress is facing going into this election.
All right, Chris Oates.
I mean, well, first of all, Chris, if you run for office on a platform of taxing millionaires, I will donate to your campaign. I don't care what party you run on. I would say the thing that I would be looking for is, yes, there's in reconciliation. I would see that. I would think, to me, we kind of, I don't want to say we know what's going to happen in reconciliation, but we know the contours of it. I would be looking at what happens after that. Is there anything else on the legislative agenda that would be coming afterwards of, like, do Republicans have XYZ planned? What's our Democrats going to do? And I see there's a question about continuing resolution. I think that to me is the next big question, is what happens with a possible government shutdown, possible continuing resolution, possible budget. I don't think there is a budget that can get a bipartisan support. So I do think that a continuing resolution is the most likely. And then I do think we're in a point where now I'd say both parties care about the deficit. And that's because I remember we were on a previous call, and I believe Chris Campbell like asked, what do you think would make it that both parties care about the deficits? And I would say probably, I think I said it was like, because we're an N=1 country, it's like when it becomes a problem, it becomes a problem. And I think with rising interest rates and rising debt payments, it's now a problem. So I do think there is now bipartisan support for an overall long-term deficit reduction plan, but that does not exist right now. There is no trust between the parties. And if Republicans pass this, which increases the deficit over the next 10 years by what, like 3.4 trillion, I think was 2.4 to 3.4 trillion, there's no way that Democrats are going to say, well, okay, now we're in favor of deficit after you've just blown up the deficit. And the other thing I would just pay attention to is, yes, some of the early polling of the different races, and you start to see if frontline Republicans get a little skittish. Because if you start to see generally speaking, the generic congressional ballot's the most predictive at this point. You start to see that get to like +8 Democratic, +10 Democratic, then you might start to see some, probably not senators, but some House Republicans, maybe a handful of them, start to worry about what's happening. And not to say that that would mean they vote against the reconciliation bill, but they would start to try to distance themselves maybe from the overall Trump administration and say, their ads would start to say, I'm an independent voice for Westchester County or the Inland Empire or something like that in Washington. So that is what I would start to see, because then it gets much harder to pass anything if you can't convince your own party to get on board with it.
Yeah, I will chime in with one thought on the continuing resolution. So, because we had a continuing resolution for this year, all the earmarks were dropped. And so, for the process for FY26, most offices, at least in the House, were saying, well, we're going to resubmit. So, they wouldn't allow any new submissions, or maybe one or two. So, there's such a backlog in these projects now that are very thoroughly vetted. We've got this very transparent system. Everything's published online. It's run by the agency. So, and we're not supposed to call them earmarks or community project funding or congressionally directed spending, but anyway, I think it would be very tough for them to do another CR given that. They're feeling a lot of pressure back home on that with that. So that gives me some hope we will not get a CR. And whether you care about domestic or defense, no one likes a CR. Like there's just no flexibility with the CR. So I think I'm hopeful that we'll get a CR. So just wanted to chime in with that opinion. But we do have some questions here, so I'm going to ask this one. So this person said, I was at a healthcare conference in March, and Pam Bondi, who runs Department of Justice, and RFK Jr., who runs Health and Human Services Department, were two of the keynote speakers. They were booed and heckled, which I have never seen at a conference before. Do you guys think that the public perception of current cabinet members will impact the off-year elections, even if Trump remains relatively popular? So just overall impact of those secretaries. What do you think? Whoever wants to chime in.
It doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help. 2006, there was various corruption scandals in Congress, and that, hurt. In the UK, there was an expensive scandals around 2010 that also hurt the incumbent. So I don't think it helps. They're not. It's not going to be the determining factor for a lot of voters, but yeah, the air of kind of corruption and chaos and incompetence definitely does not help the incumbent.
But simply the answer is no. It just no American's going to vote on it. It just, I mean, they vote on pocketbook issues, that kind of thing. Chris Oates is right. I think that if Democrats are successful in suggesting that there's there's a systemic corruption in the administration, I think that could move the needle for some Americans. But I think that I think it's an attack line that Democrats are trying, and it just hasn't landed yet. So I don't know if it will, but but I think that's one thing. I think that there may be a soft underbelly, but otherwise, no American's going to vote on who leads the departments.
You know what's so interesting is like we have learned this lesson time and time again, and yet it doesn't seem to sink in. So I think back to it was considered shocking when Bill Clinton ran against George Bush. And during George Bush's Republican convention week, where normally the Democrat stays out of the way, and vice versa, both parties do this. But for the first time, they then ran these ads that just were simply, it's the economy, stupid. And it was like, oh, that's just so shocking, but it was exactly right. And we keep seeing this every election that it's always the economy. People might say, well, I don't like the guy. Like even Bill Clinton, they didn't like the scandal, right? But they were like, but when they voted for him. So it's the same with Trump. Well, I don't like, how he treats people or whatever, but the economy. So it's like, how many times do you have to hammer this through that is what wins? It always has to be economy number one. Like, what are your thoughts on are the parties learning that? Are the candidates learning that? Like, what do you think?
I mean, the answer is that the American psyche of reset is, we have like a gnat's attention span nowadays. So I guess it's amazing how fast it is. It resets faster every single year. So we continue to, rewrite or relive history. There is, again, goes back to what I said earlier, is that if the Democrats were able to find someone that, like Bill Clinton, spoke to the average American from the heartland and be able to talk about the economy in a way that really, really impacts them, and not because they're like oligarchs or whatever that is. People don't care about that. But really talk about issues and like it really kind of be emotive and understand their pain, as Bill Clinton used to say. Then I think that would be deeply impactful. I do believe you, like Liz, I've spent a career building on the economy. But it always is the thing that moves the needle first. If the economy is doing great, then typically non-economic issues become kind of front and center in an election. But if the economy is in any way challenged or Americans feel not economically safe, then the economy will drive and does drive every election.
I mean, I say true. I mean, true that that's the single biggest variable, but a lot of things make up an election. You can have a situation like North Carolina last year where Trump wins the state, but the governorship goes to the Democrat because the Republican was such just a terrible candidate. That was the black Nazi candidate, and like so, I think a lot of things matter. I think one thing that is going to be interesting, what I'm paying attention to is the information environment. I think is the thing that a lot of folks in Washington do not understand because they got there in the old informational environment where you put out the press release, it gets a 30-second clip in the news and everyone sees it. The ads you mentioned with Bill Clinton, like, yeah, everyone saw those ads because they were all watching the same thing. What I think is really interesting, and it's about, if you, there's an interesting historical debate about when it started, but I think 2014 is a good time to start that. Voters' perceptions started to diverge from underlying economic data since then. It started to track, but then it got much more partisan. There was asymmetry in the partisanship, and there's a real question of, even if you do that, even if you got, Bill Clinton were reborn, could he connect with enough voters? Like, could he actually get his message in front of the people that he needed? Or are folks just scrolling on Instagram and Facebook and getting AI slop in what the algorithm recommends and are going to be driven towards more extreme candidates? And so, to me, the candidate that I would kind of watch as like the canary in the coal mine is Pete Buttigieg, because he's the one, though, I think has that kind of Clintonian personality to him. And he sat down for a 2-hour podcast with a bunch of comedians. And does he continue to do that? Does that seem to be effective? And if so, where does it leave everyone else? Because, like, most politicians cannot sit down for 2 hours with a group of comedians and hold their own. There's maybe a handful in all of Washington that can do that. I mean, I don't think you would, get Theo Vaughn interviewing Mitch McConnell anytime soon. So, like, that to me is going to be interesting. Does someone come along who can operate in the current informational environment, or do you get someone who, yeah, can play the inside game, but really just they they're little more than a generic D or R when they get onto the main stage.
Yeah, it brings up a really interesting question for me, and I wish this was more kind of interactive because I'd love to know what the audience suggests, and I'll because that doesn't happen, so I'll ask it more rhetorically. But it'll be fascinating to see the impact of, first of all, what the Republicans can do with the mostly Republican now scandal of what the Biden administration was like. Was he in charge? Does he have mental capacity? That kind of thing. If it turns out that someone comes forward, his doctor or someone, because I mean clearly he had cancer prior to leaving office, those kind of issues. I mean, there is a scandal there, and it likely will come out over the next 3 years. When that happens, does that invalidate any member of the Biden administration from seeking public office in the future? Right. So if they were a part of the conspiracy that led to this challenge. So it's going to be, to me, it's going to be, as a political scientist, it's going to be interesting to watch how that works. And the reason why I asked that, say that, is because Oates suggested Pete Buttigieg, but as you remember, he served in the cabinet of the Biden administration, and as oftentimes was on record saying that the president, was vigorous, that kind of thing. And just obviously, it's every American knows what they saw, and it's not true. So it'd be fascinating for me to see kind of how that plays out.
Interesting. Well, we have just a few more minutes here. So as we think about 2026 and then 2028, do you guys have any predictions for what will happen? Who will be the Republican, or a couple of the Republican lead candidates? A couple of the Democrats. I'm seeing no. For Democrats, do you have any predictions, anything? Come
The
on.
prediction I have is that we do not know who it's going to be. I'll tell you, no one in this audience or us, it is going to be someone that we're not thinking of and cannot think of right now. It's going to be someone that's outside. And I think that the only thing I could think of is because of the Trump effect, called the Trump effect. I think the Democrats could get quite creative and go completely non-government and do like a comedian, or someone, or something, some reality star or whatever.
George Clooney.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, someone like that could emerge. I mean, but genuinely, like someone like that could emerge, that you just literally can't think of now, right? So it's just so I think there's the likelihood of that is increasing every single day, because I think, thinking back, there's so many in the Democratic Party are going to be tied to the Biden administration, and I'm just telling you, as someone who's done this a long time, it's just going to take one doctor who was the Biden doctor that come back and said that he was asked to sit on information, and if that happens, it'll be a very big deal. And so I think that, again, just the scandal will continue to erupt, and it will force the Democratic Party to a place where it'll be a very unconventional candidate. I think perhaps on both sides.
All right, Chris Oates, what do you think?
I mean, I think there is the chance for someone from Florida with experience both on Capitol Hill and in the White House, maybe in the private sector as well, advising hyper-growth companies to jump into a presidential race. So I look forward to that.
Okay. Well, thank you for a great discussion as usual. We have recorded this. We'll share it with all who registered and look for our next quarterly series. We do it every 3 months. So thank you so much and have a great day.